It's the same result at the end of the day. You've still got tens of thousands of people coming over every month.
Biden administration has taken and combined asylum and refugee protection into something new without having gone to Congress.
20 states were suing the Biden administration over this, and IRLI submitted a brief on it, as they will often do.
Hi, I'm Judge Matt O'Brien. I'm here with my colleague Brian Lonergan. How are you today, Brian?
I am great, Matt.
And this is the Immigration Reform Law Institute's podcast, No Border, No Country. So, Brian, the Biden administration has recently announced some changes to its asylum policies, a number of these which appear to be problematic from the standpoint of border integrity and national security. So tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Sure. As everyone who follows anything knows, the situation at our border is a disaster, and it has been for about 2+ years now. We have an election year coming up next year, so this is something that I believe and others believe Biden is preparing to do to make himself look like the law and order president that he is not. He has authored this disaster at the border. It's really out of control now. It's been out of control for a long time, but now he wants to create the perception that he is cracking down and that he's actually a law and order president. So one of the things he's doing is he's using this phone app called CBP One, which is for Customs and Border Protection. It was started under the Trump administration, but it was really not used for this purpose. What they're using it for now is they want to get rid of these really unpleasant images at the border of hordes and hordes of people storming the border, coming over en masse. So the idea is that they will use this app from wherever they're coming from and begin this process of filing for asylum outside of the United States. And then when they get to the border, they can set up an appointment with CBP officials who will then shepherd them through into the United States. IRLI is now involved in this case. There's a press release on our website, IRLI.org. You can read about this. What's going on here is that they are not doing anything to improve the situation. All they're doing is making it a slightly less tumultuous process. But what you're really going to find is that they can go through this dance where, okay, it's not chaotic at the border now, or it's not as chaotic as it has been. We're gonna take all this illegal immigration and run it through the app, essentially. But for the average person living in this country who's paying taxes and witnessing this spectacle, it's the same result at the end of the day. You've still got tens of thousands of people coming over every month. And in that press release, it talks about how in this particular case, there are, I believe, 20 states were suing the Biden administration over this, and IRLI submitted a brief on it, as they will often do. I identified 4 countries. I believe it's Venezuela, Cuba, a couple others. They're estimating 30,000 per month are still going to come over. So what have they accomplished in this process? They're still going to have huge numbers of people coming over the border. We're still going to have to provide for them, travel-wise, healthcare-wise, education, everything that we're still doing. So it's really just, it's smoke and mirrors. It's not going to help anything.
How's the app working? As you know, I worked in government for a long time, and my experience was that government attempts to use technology don't usually end very well. So what's the situation here?
It's about as good as you would expect. The people who are using it are reporting lots and lots of bugs and glitches in it. What we cited, there's also a commentary on our site that delves into this in more detail. Some of these migrants, these aspiring asylum seekers, are reporting, and this is not someone in our office saying this, these are the migrants on the ground trying to use the app. They cannot upload a photo, which it requires as part of the process. They're saying once you upload the photo, it cancels out your application and you have to start over again. There's all kinds of things. It's reminiscent of the Obamacare website. Remember that?
I remember
how
that.
There was much fanfare how they rolled this out. It was going to be so easy, and then it was a disaster. They had to totally redo it, I believe. So it's like that. It's the same efficiency and technological savvy that you've come to expect from the federal government. So in a nutshell, it's a disaster too.
So this raises a question, Brian. The way these folks who are coming here to the U.S. have been portrayed in the media is that these are the downtrodden, oppressed, huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And as they walk down the roads, they're surrounded by a cloud of dust like Pigpen from the Peanuts because they're desperately in need of a hot bath and a warm meal. So where are these people getting smartphones to file these applications? And if they're coming from such technologically backwards, downtrodden countries, how are there networks that they can send in these applications via this app?
That is an outstanding question, and that's one that I asked in that commentary as well. That's also on the IRLI website. There are guesses as to where that's coming from. If you look on social media, you'll often see memes to that effect where they will show the people you're describing, and they've got a late model iPhone, and it's got a nice case on it. It looks very good, and people are saying, we're being told that these are the tired, the poor, and the hungry, to quote the placard on the Statue of Liberty, and yet they've got phones that probably a lot of Americans wish they had. Who's paying for the calling plans for those phones? Because they're clearly they're often talking on the phone. There's no documented, verified answer to that question, but a lot of people would imagine there are a lot of charities at the border helping these people. It's been shown that a lot of these kind of Soros-connected groups and UN-connected groups are getting them debit cards and all kinds of other resources. So it would not be out of the realm of possibility that along with those things, they're also being furnished with very nice phones.
Well, and I think the other side of this is a lot of these people aren't that bad off, and a lot of these countries, even though they may have some bad areas, which there's a bad area a few blocks away from where we're sitting that I wouldn't want to go in broad daylight without police protection. So I think that's true in every country. But I don't know. I've been shocked when I have looked at the footage here and you see these caravans of people moving to the border, and a lot of them are wearing Adidas sneakers and Nike clothing and Levi's jeans. And, quite frankly, they don't look like they're all that bad off. And that's pretty shocking to me. Our colleague that works at our sister organization, Pavel, who originally came here from Poland, has a picture on his desk of him as a little kid in what he refers to as commie clothing, which he said when he got put on a plane here to come from Poland and land in Chicago, he wore the clothes that everybody had in Poland. And when you look at these things, these are the most horribly bad quality, poorly produced clothes. And he said that's all that was available there. And yet, most people, if you ask them if the folks coming from Central America were worse off than the folks coming from Poland in the 1980s, would say, the people in Central America are much worse off. And yet, discussions I've had with Pavel, he had to wait a year and a half to have a phone installed. And when the phone installer came in the 1990s to install the phone, he had like a 1960s era phone with cloth insulation and the dial that clicks to install. So it's kind of shocking to me. What does this say about technology and how it's changing the world?
Well, as far as our federal government, they're way behind the curve because the apps they make don't work, and you would think. They're so working closely with big tech nowadays, you would think that they could make an app that's just the best thing you've ever seen. But I guess on a certain level, you can say, well, at least the government is trying to leverage technology to offset some of the pressure on the Border Patrol down there. But as we said earlier, the end result is the same. So this, to me, reeks of politicians trying to look like they're doing something about the problem, when at the end of the day, it's just more of the same.
Well, and now here's the thing that puzzles me as a former immigration judge. So these folks are all still in their own countries, or they're outside of their countries on the way here, correct?
Yes.
So doesn't the asylum statute say that people who are entitled to asylum are people who are either in the U.S. or at the border of the U.S. requesting protection?
Right. Well, as we've learned from the arguments of the anti-borders crowd, the rules don't really matter. It's emotionalism, it's feelings, it's optics. That's what governs their world, and that's who we have making the decisions on these things at the highest levels right now.
So for our viewers who may not be familiar with this, U.S. law offers two forms of protection for people who are allegedly fleeing persecution in their own countries. One of those is asylum, which applies specifically to people who are in the U.S. or who are at the border of the U.S. asking for protection. The other one is refugee status. Now, refugee status applies to people who are in their home country, and there is a carve-out in there that allows the president, in certain limited circumstances, to allow refugee protection to be accorded to people who are outside of their country of citizenship or country of last residence, but who are not in or near the U.S. And so basically what it sounds like to me is the Biden administration has taken and combined asylum and refugee protection into something new without having gone to Congress to ask them to do that. Is that the way it looks to you?
Yes, and there are a lot of other elements of this asylum issue that we should dive into. We're going to do that in the second half of the program, and we'll do it right after this.
I'm Tom Homan. The Biden administration is reversing America's progress on immigration, reversing ICE's ability to deport criminal illegal aliens, reversing job protections for Americans, and construction of the wall. That's why I've joined IRLI, the Immigration Reform Law Institute. IRLI uses the courts to stop bad immigration policies. Join me. Support IRLI at IRLI.org. Help win the immigration fight in the courtroom. Paid for by the Immigration Reform Law Institute.
Welcome back. This is the IRLI podcast, No Border, No Country. So Brian, just before we left for the break, you were saying there's some other aspects of the asylum process and the refugee process and issues that come up because of all this that we need to discuss. So what's the most important thing?
Well, I wanted to get your take on this as a judge. It occurs to me in observing all these issues that the asylum process is clearly being exploited and abused by the anti-borders movement. We all have heard stories about how these lawyers will coach these asylum seekers to say the magic words, and that was and I want you to expand on this, but it seems like it was designed for a very particular type of person coming in here under a particular type of circumstances, and what we're getting is they're using this asylum process as sort of the catch-all to get as many people in, and the way they are determining if these people actually fit into these categories is not what it should be, and the fact that when the process is allowed to play out completely, many of these people are determined not to have legitimate claims. What do you think of that?
I think that's 100% dead on. So asylum did not exist until the 1980s. The U.S. signed on to the UN Refugee Convention in 1951, 1951-52. That was passed by the UN. The U.S. signed on to it immediately. However, refugee status was typically handled by Congress on a case-by-case basis, and so what they did was they passed specific legislation in response to geopolitical emergencies. Around the time that the Vietnam War concluded, Congress decided that we needed some way to have an analog for refugee status for people who were here in the United States. A lot of scholarly debate over whether that was a wise decision. I happen to think it wasn't. Before that, asylum was that thing that you remember from like the spy movies in the 60s or the World War II movies where someone goes over the wall of the U.S. Embassy or consulate and say, I'm claiming asylum. And people were offered protection usually from totalitarian governments, communism, Nazism, things of that nature. But in any case, Congress put in an analog to the refugee status into the Immigration and Nationality Act via legislation that was passed in the 1980s. And it was designed very specifically to protect people who were fleeing their own government on the basis of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Pardon me. So there's some problems with those categories. Okay, race, pretty clear. Religion, pretty clear. Nationality, does that refer to ethnic nationality or does it refer to citizenship in a particular country? That's never been made abundantly clear. What is membership in a particular social group? No one knows. That was added by the Swedish delegate to the UN convention at the last moment when they had been engaged in negotiations for like 36 hours straight without a break. He threw that in there, and the American delegate and the British delegate said, what does that mean? And he said, everybody knows what it means. And they said, all right, we got to get this thing passed, and everybody signed off on it. During the Obama administration, people started to raise the issue of, do people who are victims of domestic violence or who are victims of criminal groups qualify as members of a particular social group? And under any reasonable interpretation, they don't, but there are a couple of liberal circuits, particularly the Ninth Circuit, that decided that, oh yes, that is a basis for asylum. The problem is, it's not the government that is engaging in this behavior. Well, there's an exception in the asylum statute that allows people to claim asylum when it's their government or parties that the government is unable or unwilling to control. And parties the government is unable or unwilling to control, the classic example of that is something like the FARC in Colombia. The Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia was the Marxist rebel group that at one point succeeded in taking over a portion of Colombia and running it as an independent state. So parties the government is unable or unwilling to control refers to private parties like the FARC that have somehow succeeded in taking over governmental functions. It also refers to parties that the government is using as a proxy to persecute people. This is very common in the USSR, where ethnic groups that were at odds with the government would be given special privileges if they would engage in rape, pillage, and torture on behalf of the Communist Party. So it's a narrow exception, but Obama was a firm believer in the rest of the world is not as nice as the U.S. Therefore, everyone who comes from the rest of the world should be entitled to come to the U.S. if they want to be. And asylum was never designed to be a free pass into the U.S. for someone who lives in a place where conditions are not the same as the U.S. And you wouldn't believe the arguments that I would have with some of the attorneys who were presenting asylum cases in front of me when I was an immigration judge. They would come in and they would say, well, so-and-so is a member of a particular social group, which is victims of MS-13. And it's like, okay, how is this person a victim of MS-13? Well, MS-13 came to her house and robbed her. It's like, okay, there's a criminal justice system in El Salvador. She couldn't prevail upon it. Why? Well, because the police are all crooked. Well, did she go to the police? No. And we would just go around in circles, and they would say, well, the fact that there is crime and that the police haven't prohibited it is evidence of the fact that the government has lost control of the country. And I would say, have you guys ever driven through East Baltimore? And, they would go, what does that have to do with anything? I'd say, there's MS-13 in Manassas, there's MS-13 in Baltimore. And I mean, it's just ridiculous. The fact is that if the United States were to accept everyone who is a victim of a crime in a foreign country as an asylee, there would literally be no room left for Americans here. We'd run out of resources, we'd run out of water. I mean, it's just insanity. And so the question that everybody should be asking is, if we have refugee protection, do we really even need asylum?
We talk on here earlier about how the activists on the other side will employ emotional appeals to get what they want. This seems like more of that, because anyone who follows pop culture in this country, domestic violence is very much a hot button issue. It will trigger very strong emotions from people, and often cases rightly so. But to take it and apply it to this situation and say, well, you're a victim of domestic violence, therefore you must travel 1,500 miles north to get away from whoever's causing that. Have we not, I know we did during the Trump years, have a third country agreement whereby you had to go to the nearest country first to try to get away from this persecution. Why does it require them to travel as far as they're traveling to get away from essentially an abusive husband or something like that?
Well, it doesn't. I think in a lot of the cases, there's no, I mean, a large number of the cases that I heard, it would be my husband, Flavio. Do you have a marriage certificate? Well, I didn't marry him. We just call him my husband. Culturally, that's who he was. So there may or may not have been a boyfriend who may or may not have been abusive. The simple fact is, Brian, the United States is a great country. Despite the fact that we have a lot of unpatriotic people here who don't appreciate just how wonderful a country this is. It's the freest country in the world with the fairest justice system of any country in the world. And it's the most economically prosperous country in the world. So the fact is that people want to be here. And if you are a Venezuelan and you're subject to persecution, well, then you could theoretically go next door to Nicaragua or make your way to Mexico or make your way to Brazil, all of which are in marginally better shape than Venezuela, and you could be protected. But people don't want to go there. They want to come to the United States. They want to live in nice houses and drive nice cars. Now, that's also relative, because there are lots of people in these countries who are living perfectly nice lives, and they make relatively decent money and are able to eat and keep a roof over their head. It's just not the same as it is in the United States. And so you have a huge problem. Now, as far as the third country agreements go, those are useful because they make other countries a partner in enforcing the third party asylum rule. But as a matter of international law, if you are genuinely subject to persecution, and this makes perfect sense, the theory is that if you're being subject to torture, unfair imprisonment, the Cossacks come into your village and rape your wife because you're Jewish, just what happened in the pogroms and what happened in the Soviet Union, then you're desperate for protection in the sense that you don't want to be subject to that kind of behavior anymore. So the first place that you can get to where you're not subject to that kind of abuse is the place where you seek asylum, and that's a fundamental principle of international law. It's where you seek protection, where you declare yourself a refugee. And, post-World War II, it was common practice that people went, boom, I'm over the border into the next place, please let me stay here, I don't want to go back to Nazi Germany. There's nothing in international law that says you have an unfettered right as a citizen of the globe to go to whatever sovereign nation that you would prefer to be in and be admitted there. I mean, if that were the case, I might very well go to the French Riviera and claim asylum there. Happens to be a very nice place. I've spent many a happy moment there and have wonderful memories, but the fact is that nobody's going to find that to be a compelling argument. So it's a mystery to me as a matter of law and policy why we are willing to allow so many of these people to seek asylum here when they've crossed 4, 5, 6 safe countries, or at least safer than their own countries, on the way to the United States.
Now, isn't it true that a large number of the applicants for asylum end up getting ultimately rejected based on their claims?
That is true. A very significant majority of them wind up getting denied asylum. That, of course, depends on a lot of different factors. There are a number of immigration judges who, on principle, because they happen to agree with the extreme radical left political interpretations, would grant asylum to Iraq. But when you have judges who are reading the law accurately and applying it to the facts correctly, then the fact is that most of these people will not be granted asylum. I had like a 96% asylum denial rate. That's not because I don't think people should have asylum or because I have any axe to grind against migrants. It's because the cases that came in front of me consistently said things like, I was the victim of a crime in El Salvador. And my questions were, does El Salvador have a police department? Yes. Does it have a correction service? Yes. Does it have courts? Yes. Well, then, unless you prevailed upon those and were denied because of your race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, political opinion, you don't have an asylum claim. And that was the case in the vast majority of cases that I saw. Now, unfortunately, what I experienced, along with my colleague David White, who was dismissed along with me, and a number of other people throughout the country, a whole bunch of the Trump judges who insisted on being constitutionalists and applying the law as written and respecting things like the separation of powers, they were forced out. And so, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're now in the unfortunate position where people who ascribe to a certain political agenda believe that it is the ends justify the means, and it's perfectly acceptable to ignore the law as long as they're accomplishing the objectives of their political agenda.
What about the idea that while many of them are ultimately rejected, the initial bar to hurdle is very low? What's the terminology they use? Is it credible fear? Is that what they say? And it's very hard to prove that, but they can get through the first stage?
In my experience, the credible fear interviews, the asylum officers have been repeatedly told to find credible fear even when it doesn't exist. And so unless you have a particularly, an officer with a large amount of integrity who's willing to push back against the machine, it's not so much that that's a low bar, it's that it's been rendered a low bar. The fact is, that's an American standard that was added to the law recently. We are required under international law as a state party to the UN Convention on Refugees to have a system in place to grant refugee protection. However, refugee and asylum protections are completely discretionary, so we're not obligated to give them to anyone, and we're not obligated to admit anyone to the U.S. to seek refugee status. How you accord refugee status and asylum status, which is essentially a refugee who's here, either in the U.S. or at the border, is a matter of discretion for the receiving country. And as a discretionary matter, you can deny asylum to somebody who qualifies on all the standards because of a discretionary reason, like they're a potential threat to the national security of the United States, you think they're a criminal, you think that they've done something in their own country that should prohibit them getting it. It's a much more nuanced and complex thing than is portrayed by the anti-borders, radical left, globalist, one world contingent.
Mm-hmm. So what about these politicians? We know they like to fancy themselves as law and order when it counts, and when they're running for re-election, let's be perfectly blunt. Are there ways that you've seen where politicians will present as very law and order, but on these issues like this, they're actually giving the store away, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think Chuck Schumer is a perfect example when it was politically expedient for him to pursue a wall and a fence and barriers and unlawfully present migrant labor, then he did so. Now he talks out both sides of his mouth and tries to tell everyone that, he's actively involved in trying to enforce the immigration laws while he's helping Joe Biden hold the door open for everyone who wants to get in. And, I guess if you think of this a different way, if you're over at the Capital One Arena and everybody's supposed to buy a ticket, but you get some roadie holding the back door open and letting anyone who wants in, then you got a conflict over, who gets the seat, the person that paid for the ticket or the person that snuck in the back door. And that's sort of the situation we have. The government of the United States is supposed to be preserving the interests of American citizens, not worrying about the interests of people with no connection to the United States who just showed up here and asked to be let into the dance without an invitation.
Right. All right. It's time we get out of here.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to stab that like button and to subscribe. This has been No Border, No Country, IRLI's podcast. And please visit IRLI's website, www.irli.org. That's IRLI.org, to support IRLI's mission of protecting the citizens of the United States, the integrity of our borders, and our national security. Thanks again for watching.